All right, let me know when you guys can see.
Yep.
Right. So tonight's going to be basic air to ground in the F-14. We're going to do a little bit of recap just because it's been a few weeks, the Apache in between, get our mind in the right place before we dive into the topic. Then we're going to talk about kind of the most basic standard employment. So it's going to be a method that pretty much regardless of whatever air to ground mission you get in a Tomcat, you can fall back on this and be effective. So even if the actual mission is to do something that's fairly advanced, like a dumb bomb loft or a low-level OCA, you could substitute this method, and it would work just as well for hitting a fixed target, a vehicle, a boat, or anything else. So it's kind of a good base. We're going to talk about some of the symbology, how it matters for both the RIO and pilot seats, go over some workflows and some examples of how to put it into practice. So first off, just a quick recap. Again, beginner level class. We're going to do it maybe advanced over the summer. For intermediate, I'm still trying to decide what falls into there, and part of the reason is because this basic workflow we're going to go over is actually pretty darn effective, but more to come on that. And we're not teaching real life procedures or giving you strict rules. People system, it's a 2-person team. There's a lot of stuff to be doing, and in air to ground that's actually much more apparent than in the air-to-air regime, although in the air-to-air it is a really big deal. But in air-to-ground, it just plain doesn't function well without 2 people. Really are gimped if both people aren't working together proper way. And it's one of the few places in the F-14 where you can't get to relatively equivalent capability with Jester, no matter how much you practice, because it's a fairly lengthy set of steps that you have to do to line up a decent air-to-ground attack. Again, we're not targeting exactly how it's done in real life. We're doing this to meet the requirements that we have in most of our missions and the types of defenses and scenarios that we see there. So not every item is going to come straight out of the NATOPS, and some may contradict it. We're going to be focusing on some of the key strengths and weaknesses here. And when it comes to air to ground, there's 2 really stark contrasts. On the one hand, you can carry a massive weight worth of munitions. 2,000-pound penetrator LGBs, lots of Mark 82s, tremendous amount of rockets. The problem is that all of these weapons have a fairly short standoff range. So in comparison to your carrier-borne brethren, you don't have HARMs, you don't have JSOWs, you don't have GBU-38s, you don't have a lot of fire and forget smart weaponry. So you really need to take that into consideration when you think about that with the Tomcat. Doesn't mean we can't do a lot of work. You definitely have a massive carry capacity. Going to remember some of our themes from before, and even though the slide on the right is air-to-air focused, these themes of, whoever isn't really heads down operating the pod, in this case, needs to be eyeballs out. If you're both staring at the lantern screen all the time, the pilot could very easily miss a manpad, lose navigational cues, or in some cases fly into terrain. Just depends on the scenario. So it's really key to have one person in, the other person out during these sort of procedures. And also the countermeasures are going to be really important. There's different areas where different team members can do better things. It's not all because, hey, the pilot's eyes are out, he's got all the countermeasures. The RIO has all the programs in the back, and those are really helpful in reducing workload during your air-to-ground runs, so we'll talk a little bit about that. But just keep those 2 topics in mind. And some notes specifically for air-to-ground. In the air-to-air section, we talked about how with a little practice and a few button bindings, at least it's my opinion that you can get most of the way up to especially what an average pilot in Rio can do, certainly better than a set that's not been practicing. In air to ground, this is not the case. Yes, you can do some stuff with Jester, but there's a significant decrease in effectivity even at the intermediate or advanced competency level. It's mainly just has to do with all the click wheeling that you make this work. Now, the tactics we're going to train here do work with Jester. It's just expected to take 20 or 40% longer for you to do it, and you're going to have more aborted runs and just kind of struggle a little bit more. And as you're doing it, one person is just going to be overwhelmed in terms of SA, so it is a little bit costly, although you can do it, and a pilot should know how to do it, because we don't always have 4 RIOs on mission night, but we sometimes have 4 Tomcats. So it's just something to keep in mind of in the air-to-ground regime. It is something that isn't moderate to okay with Jester. It's just tough. Let's go ahead and get started. The most common method of employment in the 40th for the Bombcat is a strike into a relatively sanitized target area. This means that you don't have a lot of SA 10s, 20s, and 11s. The main reason being is what we talked about before. We don't have standoff smart weaponry. You're going to rely on a seed package to clear those sort of assets out, and then you can sort of fly over some of the smaller SAM systems that cap out at 20 to 26,000 feet. But in general, the AO needs to be kind of whittled down to TORs or anti-aircraft artillery or something similar. It needs to be relatively sanitized for the Tomcat to make it in. And that's going to then be coupled with a CCRP drop. So this is a continuously computed release point. It's based on the data that the lantern pod is feeding into the jet, such that you can line up a weapon, drop it relatively close to the target, and allow the laser to guide it in. Typically you're doing this with a single drop, and the goal is not to overfly the target, because the more that you overfly the target, the more likely it is that some SAM system that might be left over can reach you, because 3 nautical miles out and up is a lot further than just flying direct overhead that SAM at 20,000 feet. So you're looking to do your drop, cut out, and laze the target the entire time, such that you can hit the threat or the building or whatever else you have. Typically you are keeping your speed somewhere between 300 and 450 knots. The key really is you want to be constant. The Tomcat computer is not a fast operating machine, and so as you run into the target, you want to have very few speed changes and altitude changes and things like that as possible to allow the computer to get the best solution that it can. For altitude, you want to be above the threat, deconflicted to friendlies in the area so you don't have a midair. And we'd also recommend that you use your wings in bomb mode prior to dropping. This is part of the reason I say 350 to 450, because while technically in bomb mode, if you go fast enough, the wings will sweep back, then the computer will start to decorrelate with what it's able to do and what it's able to think. So you want to be in bomb mode and at a speed where the 60-degree sweep of bomb mode remains intact as you run it. It's accuracy. We use the lantern pod with area track for things like buildings and point track for vehicles and boats. So let's talk about how we look at the right symbology and get this into action. So first few things are, how do you determine how you get to the target, where the target is, what things can you do before the mission starts to make sure that it's going to be as smooth and easy as possible? Well, the first is to use the Tomcat specific waypoints. We don't have a massive 500 plus waypoint library like the F-16. We only get 3 normally assigned waypoints, and then you have the customized Tomcat waypoints for fixed point, initial point, service target, and several others. Those other waypoints have to be set up in the mission editor with the abbreviations in the comments field. Otherwise, they will not appear in the Tomcat computer. Additionally, if you place a custom configured point like ST into waypoint 1, you will lose the extra waypoint 1 slot. So you need to make sure that you're assigning those custom waypoints starting on waypoint 4, 5, and 6, such that they don't overwrite basic waypoint functionality of waypoints 1 through 3. You can also assign these waypoints in flight and program them using the upfront, or sorry, not the upfront controller, using the drum computer to your left, which we see on the top right of the screen here, by switching it to the nav page, and you can plug it in with the buttons above that with lat long and everything else. So if someone wants to give you a new IP and a new service target via JTAC or one of our FACs, you can have the RIO plug those in. Additionally, you can mark them on the F-10 map as a single pilot and have Jester plug them in, and then they will appear both in the computer and in the TID for reference. These are what some of the symbols look like. From the TID, the RIO can also hook one of these and then drag it around. So you can also drop so you don't have a surface target with lat longs. If you knew roughly it was at a position you just overflew, or you have a rough guess, you can drag and drop one. Although I'm just going to say straight away, it's very imprecise because you have no moving map. Just keep that in mind. It's possible to enter them that way. Finally, you can enter them with Jester. So if you mark it on the F-10 map, you can tell him to enter a steer point. So I can drop a dot on the map in F-10. I can call it, Johnny's beer case, and then I can tell Jester to add Johnny's beer case as surface target, and he'll do that. Surface target that you can attack off of that. There's multiple ways to do it. If they are loaded properly in these special locations, you will see them in the kneeboard on the right. So we can see here there's a properly entered fixed point, IP, surface target, and home base, all separate of waypoints 1 through 3 and separate of your startup ramp. Just a way to maximize utility with the Tomcat here. In terms of 40th employment, the way that I'm going to instruct us to move towards in terms of definitions of these, I'm a little more specific than how they're laid out in Chuck's guide. So fixed point, I'm interpreting that for the 40th as a marshal point prior to a strike in a safe area. And this is assuming you're going to set up separately from your 3 standard waypoints. So if you had the marshal as steer point 2 for everybody else in the package, it would be fine not to enter a fixed point. Just treat steer 2 as your fixed point. An initial point should be where your designation run or attack run should begin from. And you want that to be, this is your run-in, ideally 8 or 12 nautical miles or further from the target. Any closer to the actual target itself, you're not going to have the time to search, locate, queue designate, and do the other things you need to do. So recommend 8 or 12 nautical miles away from the target. It may be in many cases that this initial point is an area where there are hostiles, so don't expect IP to be a safe area. Surface target, that's where you know that the target is, or where you know your search for the target should begin. So it might be a field that has tanks in it, or it might be a specific dam or building, or it might be a specific vehicle that you have precise coordinates for. But what you're actually going to either look in or drop on is the surface target area. The hostile area, this is a nearby enemy location that the F-14 should try and avoid. So let's say the seed opened a hole in the SAM net, but there's still another SA-10 or 11 nearby. You want to drop a point on that, and in the briefing say, hey, the hostile area is an SA-11, so stay 40 miles away from that point. And as the RIO's referencing the TID as you're running in, you can make sure that you steer clear of that hostile area. And finally, the defended point. This is a location that the F-14 is supposed to be protecting and you're not employing weapons on. So it can be a reference of friendlies where The JTAC is telling you, okay, drop 2 miles east of this, drop 3 miles north of this, or across the road from this. It isn't super specific. Remember, it's still an F-14 computer, but that's what this is meant to be, is a defending reference point. You do not want to be employing weapons over that location. Now let's talk about some symbology for standard laser guided drop. There's a few things for pilots that you need to remember. I'm not saying the rest of the items on this page aren't important. You can go and read Chuck's guide about how to interpret these, but really the ones we're focused on as a pilot are the steering cues. So up on the front you have this horizontal bar with a slash through it that tells you the direction that the target is in relative to your nose. So if the bar is to the left and 60 degrees off to the left, it'll be way over here, and it'll say L, and then it'll have 60 over there. And if it's 30 degrees to the right, it'll say R and then 30. So you know what direction to turn, and you know how many degrees to turn. To make fine adjustments, you just try and line it up in the center, and right when it's directly over the letter, either L or R, it's perfectly lined up, and you should see L0 and R0 flashing back and forth as you hold it right on the center line. The next is the bomb release cue. So this is the countdown. Part of the reason that we start 8 miles out is if you're at 25,000 feet and 450 knots and you run it at 8 miles, this thing will start ticking down almost right away. It's your time until release. I like to start my runs where that is stuck to the ceiling a little bit further out. So you've got at least that 30 seconds or so to actually take your time and line up and do what you need. As a pilot, you're really just concerned with kind of the final few seconds, but you want to make sure long before you're halfway down this bar that the plane is in a constant speed, a constant attitude, everything's set up. You've got your eyes on the target, looking inside and outside for threats and things like that. Rio will talk about his view of this in a moment, but it's a little bit different. And then finally the release point, so it does give you a number of seconds as well. Finally, on the HUD, probably the most important thing before you begin an attack run is if you don't see ORD on your HUD and it's plainly lettered, does not have an X over it, means something is wrong with your config. Either you're not in air-to-ground mode, or you don't have master arm on, or on your stick you have Phoenix or another weapon selected. You need to make your air-to-air selector to neutral off. There's a variety of things here. Bombs are hung. They're not selected in the back. There's a million things that can make this computer's broken, X out. But if you have it completely lit up and lettered here, you are okay to start going in. So that's a really important piece of symbology. Also, the fall line. So the bomb fall line that's here will correspond with the view on the lantern. So you're basically flying to line up your aircraft flight path marker with that fall line. However, I find that using the VDI is more precise, so I'd recommend you use the VDI. Finally, if you are flying alone, a red circle in your vision is the Q eyeballs designation reticle. We'll talk about the different queuing forms, but if you see a red circle jumping all over the place, you're probably in a single player Tomcat and you got to turn off or designate with your Q eyeball. Next for the Rio, similar screen, but a little bit more to look at because you have more setup to do. The number one thing, and we're going to talk about this in many of the future slides, is the pod orientation indicator. This dot is telling you from the top down, so if you imagine the cross as your plane looking from God's eye down, that dot is telling you the direction and distance that the pod is pointing from you. So it's up here at the top, it's forward, and we can cross-check this with the steering cue right now. Left 8 degrees. Well, we can see this is from the center left over here about 8 degrees. So this is how you know where your pod is pointing. It's really important because if you're in the back and the pilot is, say, like, pointing the nose at the target, or he says, hey, something at 2 o'clock, you need to take this dot and move it to that location before your pod is going to see what you're seeing outside the cockpit with your eyeballs. So just remember, this is referencing the orientation that the pod's in. Obviously, as the RIO, you care about steering cues just as much as the pilot does. Same with release cues. We've got a few other things you need to care about as well. The probably second most important is the laser armed symbol. If your laser's not armed and you run in, you can do everything right for the drop, including loose the bomb, and it's not going to hit anything because your laser's not turned on. That's really disappointing, to toss a bomb that doesn't hit anything. So definitely make sure you've got your L and flashing L when the laser is actually lasing. And finally, your tracking type. This line here, where on this screen it says area, it's going to sync between all your different designation types, whether that's Q waypoint, Q HUD, Q des, rates, area track, point track. It's always going to tell you down there what mode the pod is in. So it's really important to know, because if you're trying to queue up Q designate and you don't hit the button and it still says area, it might be looking at the INS area from your last pass, which is moved because the jet's been maybe tossing and turning all over the sky, and you're not actually pointing at what you should be. Up your Q designate, and you should see a Q des show up there in a mode. So always double check that you're in the mode that you think you're in. It's really helpful. Next up, a few important controls. I do have a controls sheet at the end that ranks all these, and there are more than just these that are important on that control sheet. But just for the topic of tactics and employment, one of the sets we want to talk about are the Q waypoint. So one of the best ways to get your pod on or near a target is to queue it up to a waypoint that ties to the intelligence in the briefing. Makes it a lot simpler than trying to find this target on your own. So knowing how to go up and down the waypoints in that mode is really important. This button also allows you to set point and area track. Switch. The next is the S4 right hat. That allows you to take the different queuing. So Q HUD, Q des, snow plow, etc. So definitely having all these bound is really important, and we'll talk about how those get used in a bit. And both stages of the two-stage trigger are important for the lantern, for setting the laser and manual. So what about designation modes? Well, there are quite a few, but the primary ones that we want to encourage you to get really familiar with are the QWP, Q waypoint. This means the pod will point at the waypoint. Obviously, if the mission creator's been generous enough to tell you exactly where the target is, then this is the easiest way to point your pod at it. Really effective. Anything that's in waypoint 1 through 3, as well as the custom ones, can be selected with this by switching to the desired steer point with left and right. So really important to have that. And if you do have all choices available, this is probably the one you want to start with. The next is Q des, Q designation. When you are using the pod and you select a target and add it to this Q designation, and basically what it's doing is saving a temporary waypoint into the pod, such that if you turn away or lose the target temporarily, you can just call up this last known temporary waypoint. Now, it's not going to save them over and over again like a mark point in the Viper or a Jeff or anything else that has that functionality. It's only going to show you the last one you saved, but then you can recall that last one over and over until you save a new one. So why might this be useful? Well, we can fly towards a target that doesn't have a known waypoint. We can locate it with the pod and pin that with QDES into the pod, and then turn away and come back for another attack. or if we had to say roll the aircraft in an evasive manner or in a way that the pod wasn't able to see the target, we can ensure that we're not only relying on the pod's INS when we start seeing the target again. We can instead hit recall, and it will go and locate the point that it's saved, some GPS coordinates in the pod. So it's a really helpful way to save custom targets. The last one is for when you're really blind. So you don't have a waypoint, you don't know where any target is, so you haven't Q designated anything yet. But hey, maybe the pilot says, dude, I can see the AAA coming up from south of the city. Can I just point the nose at it? Yeah, sure, no problem. So now the pilot can pull that target into his HUD. You activate Q HUD. The pilot will tell you when he has nose on, and then as a RIO, you select Q designate to save that point. Now at least your pod is pointed where your pilot has seen something or wants you to look. So at least after the first time you use QHUD, now you hopefully have saved a QDes, so you've moved it up one in the quality chain, but it's still a really helpful mode. Technically, you could use Snowplow for this, but the tough thing about Snowplow is the target's going to be under your nose, so basically the pilot can't help you see what you're trying to see unless he looks down. So I find that it's much less useful to use Snowplow than it is to use QHUD. Now, what does QHUD look like? So when the QHUD mode is selected, you see here in the indicator, we've got QHUD down here, and the pilot is going to use the winged nose pointing indicator to point the pod. And you can see they're both at the exact same spot. So if the pilot saw tracers coming up from this road, he points the nose at it, makes sure the aircraft is steady, tells the person in the back to designate, and then it will switch from QHUD to QDes as you activate the QDesignation mode. At that point, you can turn away and come back on another pass with your QDes. One key thing to think of when you're activating QHUD, if your pod is pointed in some other direction, like maybe back and to the right, it does take a while for the pod to swing around and point itself forwards. So before you hit QDes, tell your pilot if the pod's still traversing, hey, we're not lined up yet. If you're actually lined up and you see the pod indicator right at the top here, and oddly enough, it usually crosses right into the compass, then probably you're not ready to designate, and the pilot's going to need to keep pointing the aircraft wing symbol at the target until the pod traverses. Just keep that in mind. This orientation indicator is super helpful to figure out what the pod's doing. All right, so let's talk about the pod itself. So you've probably noticed when you look at the pod, whether it's in a Gulf War.
Question.
Sure, go ahead.
Do we have gesture keybinds already for this Q HUD, Q Des, things like that?
So with Jester, when you tell him to designate using the Jester wheel, he does use QDes at that point. And he will recall that QDes point every time that you turn back around and tell him to designate target again. QHUD is not really necessary for Jester because you have Q eyeballs. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, but you don't have to fly straight at the target to put the pod on it because you can cube eyeballs anywhere that you can see, kind of like a Jehemix, and he'll find it. It does take a while, but of course, imagine if you were flying past a target at your 3 o'clock and you told the RIO, hey dude, look at 3 o'clock, you'll see this building. It's probably going to take your RIO like 60 to 90 seconds to move the pod over there, look through the little soda straw, figure out exactly which building you meant, and you're going to have a little conversation the whole time. Now a little to the left, now a little to the right. Jester's time to acquire Q eyeballs is long for that reason. It's trying to mimic the human conversation you would have to actually put the pod in that location. that would be the way to do it. Hopefully that answers your question. In terms of keybinds, I know they've added a few more, but there's not a lot of shortcuts for the pod, specifically in terms of pilot gesture wheel. And that's yet another reason why air to ground and the Tomcats really degraded in speed and efficiency compared to having.
All right, thank you.
Right. So let's go ahead and talk about the pod itself. And again, like if you guys have seen a Gulf War video or flown our bird, it has this weird looking squiggly line on the screen. Everybody thinks, oh gee, is that thing cracked? No, it's not. This is called the masking line. And why that's important is if we look at the jet, the pod sits on the right shoulder point where this little purple line is. And if the pod points anywhere outside of this zone, it's going to be looking at the airplane itself and not see through it, since we're not Wonder Woman with the invisible airplane. So it's really important to think about how does this affect how you run into a target, how do you keep a target in view the entire time you're lasing it, and establish SA at this point. It's a big reason why the Tomcat can't really attack to the left, for example, because the pod's on the wrong side. So there's a few key areas inside the mast that are important. The first and most important is the targeting zone. The targeting zone is during the period you are looking for targets, and while you are sorting before you drop on the target and rolling into it, it should be in this area, either dead ahead or slightly to the right. If it's not in that area, we'll talk about some of the bad things that can happen. The second zone is the lasing and BDA zone. After you pickle the weapon, you're going to end up with the pod facing to the side or behind you as you go through a standard roll-off maneuver and hold the laser on the target. Now you'll notice that neither of these two zones go to the edge of the masking zone. It is on purpose, because if, for example, when you roll off the target, the pod gets too far back into the right, you'll end up in a situation where you cannot maneuver the airplane to keep the pod in that space any longer. It starts to slide off, just like if it was a curved, rock with ice on it and you're standing on top. Once you get to the edge, you just can't recover anymore. So you need to make sure, as the pilot and the RIO, that the RIO is giving steering instructions to the pilot, and also that the pilot is occasionally, as he's maneuvering, checking that positioning point. Right now, of course, it's forward in this diagram, but it would be sliding around to the right as he turned off the target, that it does not fall out of the lasing zone. That is a slippery slope. You will not be able to recover, and if the pod gets masked before the bomb hits, you just wasted that bomb. So you gotta hold the point in there long enough that the target gets hit, after which you can just roll away. The second zone is the abort zone. This happens to the front right of the aircraft because the pod actually sits just under one of the leading edges of the Tomcat's shoulder at the front of the wing. And if it gets too far to the right, you can't actually roll the plane far enough to the right to bring the target up to the nose to actually be able to drop the bomb. In the process, you will mask the pod and lose the designation point. So if it gets too far to the right, you won't actually be able to attack it on this run. You're going to come back on a second run and do it again. So these are the key points, and if we overlay them onto the display, this is what they look like. Got the target zone up here. Notice it's really far from the masking edge. But what I'm telling you is if you aren't running in hot with a known target and the pod point is somewhere outside of this zone, you're never going to be able to roll the aircraft right far enough to keep it on the whole way in. You'll have to designate it, leave, and come back again. So really key. Now, how does this apply to identifying a target? So let's assume, man, Jester's really got to go. and he's going to drop a deuce up here in this toilet, and we're going to have to designate it with a lantern pod. Well, what do? Do we just run straight at this thing and YOLO right into the air defenses? He doesn't even know where that porta potty is yet. It's stuck in a forest, right? So he can't find it quick enough, and this is why you don't want to fly straight at the target any longer than you have to. Now, I get it. Sometimes we talked earlier about using QHUD. In order to use QHUD, you have to temporarily be pointed at the target. But the thing to remember is that when you're going straight in, it minimizes your search time and puts you in the threat zone the fastest because you're flying right at them. And instead, we need more time to find and designate the target. So how do we do this while staying within our pod limits? Well, crank, kind of like an air-to-air, right? It allows us to continue moving. It allows us to put the broadest section that the pod can manage towards the target. And we're able to take time to search and find it and then designate and turn in. Now, there's no precise angle here. It's going to be limited by what you see in your symbology in the green zone. So it should always be, I'll just go back to this again and we'll show it later, but always be thinking on this lantern pod, how far can I turn and still maintain this green targeting zone? That's going to be your actual angle. And it's going to depend on how high or low you are. So if you're too low, the pod has to be looking up further, and it's more likely it's going to be up over here. If you're really high, you can be a higher angle off, and it's still looking down this way. So there's no perfect angle or rule of thumb here. Just make sure as you turn off to the left to begin your targeting run that you keep it in the green box. Again, good rule of thumb as you start a pass is to be about 8 to 12 nautical miles away or more. This is your IP, where the aircraft is at the bottom. And you want to kind of turn a little bit to the left, and again, start searching and make sure that your green cone here is pointed at the where you think. So we're flying, looking, we're searching. What does a successful search run look like? Well, first, for ease of use, we engage the best queuing solution that we have. If that's a waypoint, we come in using Q waypoint. And that's going to give us a location that's either on the target or very close by. And then we begin our search. So, the pod, as we're flying up this line, starts by pointing at the waypoint. Maybe you look left. Nope, that's a gun. Maybe you look right. Oh, there's the toilet. Great. Well, once you find the toilet, because it's not on the waypoint, you Q-des that toilet. Well, now you've got this designate. At least you've had a successful designation. And now you have a choice to make. The choice is how long did it take you, and are you outside of the green triangle? If you're inside of the green triangle after you've designated, you know that you can now turn the aircraft to the right and begin flowing into this target because our orientation dot is within the stable targeting zone, and we can commit to an attack. Now, what happens if we need to abort? What does that look like? Well, maybe as we flowed into the zone, the pod was inside of the targeting zone, but it took us a while to find it. And then the pod came out of the zone. It either slid upwards because we were too far to the left or too low, or maybe we had to fly past the target and it slid behind us before we were able to Q designate it. It's okay. The pass is still sort of successful because you found a target. It just means that it's not possible for you to engage on this pass because the amount that you'd have to roll the airplane to the right to line up on this target, you would mask it and not be able to get the target back in the final portion of your run. So best to not attack, just use this as a designation run, drop your Q-des, go out. And when you do that, it ends up looking a little bit like a grinder. So you've flown in, you've done something, and then you've flown out to the left. For a pilot, it's kind of just like flying a left crank grinder. This attitude. And what it does is it draws similar patterns in the sky for other people to recognize, because since every abort comes out to the left and every attack goes to the right, it's pretty obvious for everybody on your team, or AWACS or whatever, to know if you actually were able to successfully commit to a run or not. Fairly simple. That takes a little bit of communications load off too, because again, this is a high workload period of time for the pilot and the RIO. You're too busy talking to each other. Communication outbound is not exactly the most important thing, so any standardization helps. As you're doing this crank as well, one thing to remember as a pilot is, because you're cranked, the target's now not under the nose, so you can see it. So what do we do when we're not heads down? We've got eyes on target. So now the pilot can watch the target as you flow up to it and see, are there man pads coming up? Was there an unexpected TOR? Do I need to break away? You have eyeballs while your RIO is stuck on the lantern trying to do a Q designate in time before you fall out of the targeting zone. Now, what does this look like from behind? Because there's a vertical component as well as a horizontal component. When we look at the targeting zone, it's not just a triangle out and to the right, it's also kind of forwards and under. You can't attack something directly under yourself either. And so you got to kind of visualize that there are limits. It's more like a spotlight pointing out front and to the right of you. So just keep that in mind. But let's say we had a successful run-in. So I'll just let you visualize this in the prior slide. We've had a successful designation on our crank. We were able to Q-des the target. During that time, we made the decision to attack while the pod was still in the targeting zone, and we've made a smooth right-hand turn to put the nose onto the target without masking the pod. Now we are hot to the target, and everything feels good. They're going to look like this. Here we are. We're turning into the target area at about 6 or 8 nautical miles. The RIO, just in the case that the pod got temporarily masked or something, he'll hit the QDES recall, which even if the pod moves slightly off, it should go back to what you designated before you turned in. And now there's going to be a drop line in the HUD and also on the VID. So as a RIO, it's time to talk your pilot onto the drop. So if you're 45 degrees to the right, tell your pilot, come right 40 degrees, nose level, speed, talk him onto it. And as you get onto the drop line, the RIO can also start selecting the area and point track options, because you're going to need one of these two to actually let the pod start lasing. It's not going to laze only from a QDES. So you're going to now switch to area track, refine your aim a little bit as you get closer to the target, and call out to the pilot how many seconds there are to drop, because he's probably got his eyes out still looking for threats as he's listening to your steering commands. He'll glance down now and again to refine it down to the last degree, but in general he should be looking for SAMs and things like that. As you get close, and close is more step 6, a discussion that you've had in advance with your RIO of what type of threats you're expecting, type of countermeasures to employ. But assuming you've made that decision and discussion, and it's radar guided AAA, for example, Shilkas, now's a good time for the RIO to hit the countermeasures chaff program that you have set up. Maybe that's 10 bundles with 2 every half second with 5 salvos or something. But now the RIO can press one button, chaff will start coming out, and you really can stop thinking about countermeasures for a little while. Reach 0, pilot lets the RIO know that he is pickled or that he plans to abort. And assuming that you pickle, now it's up to the RIO to apply the laser at the right time. So RIO now is heads down, pilot's heads up to maneuver the aircraft, and now we go into the lasing phase post-drop. So in order to not overfly the target, but still keep the laser pointed at it, we have to roll the aircraft and make sure that the lasing BDA curve that's under and to the right of our aircraft has the pod designation point in it, such that we can maintain this laser all the way until impact. See what I mean? Because as you turn, you're going to have to orient the aircraft in a more and more aggressive position to maintain this. And if you're not aggressive enough in turning away, such that the pod designator falls off and back to the right, it'll get to an area where you can't recover it unless you go totally inverted into the ground. So you've got to make sure that as you're flying your off leg, that pod designation point in the safe lasing zone all the way to impact. It's really important, and both pilots and RIOs should be giving steering advice and to each other, because of course the pilot can tell, is there terrain in the way? Is there another aircraft to avoid? Should I be aggressive because they're shooting at us? Should I be less aggressive because I've got time and all the enemy defenses are down? These are all decisions you're making by talking to each other. The key is you've got to keep this cone pointing, with the target, that such that the pod designator is inside of that lasing BDA cone. Now, of course, after the bomb hits, so the RIO, he's activated the laser with a few seconds to go. The RIO sees the explosion. Obviously, let the pilot know that the bomb missed or hit, and now the pilot knows he no longer needs to hold the pod in this position, and he can fly off however he'd like to. So this is really the complicated part of this that takes some practice, is learning how to turn off after the drop and how to maintain the pod at the right angle so it doesn't fall off the slippery slope in this until it's the target. It's a really great skill to learn, especially against boats that have like AAA defenses or other, aircraft artillery defended spots, because you're going to spend basically no time over the target and you're already going cold. It's man pads and stuff like that. So if we look at what this looks like, as you're maneuvering, the RIO's looking down at the lantern screen, and if he starts to see it getting too close to the right-hand side or too close to the edge of the slippery slope, the pilot know, hey, ease up, move the pod forward, to the right, because the designator's stuck on the target, right? The target's not going anywhere, so it's the movement of the plane that's going to matter to orient it within this slice. And you fall off that slippery slope and the pod exceeds this limit down here. Really sucks if that happens with like 3 seconds to go and your bomb misses. So all right, other considerations. Because we know that we have to attack in this manner, it means that terrain and other immovables are a big part of the planning process. If the target is, say, east of the IP point and it has a mountain to the south side, that's really going to affect your attack run, because you're going to mask the pod with the mountain or run into the mountain or have no way to make an aggressive move to keep the pod pointed at the target that forces you now to overfly. So maybe now you have to, instead of taking out the SAM on the south side, ask the seed guys to take out the SAM on the north side and then come in from the north, such that when you turn right, you're not pointing into a mountain. You're pointing to be the old run-in. So it takes some time in pre-planning to think about where the target is and what its orientation is. The left direction for an abort isn't quite as big of a deal, because aborts, you can maintain your altitude and airspeed and maneuver however you want. The reason why you abort to the left is so that you don't turn towards the target. You can still Q designate and leave to the left in any attitude and come out safe. So still need to think about left hand. Obviously, if you had other friendly forces there or a grinder or something, talk to them, make sure your inbound and egress altitudes are deconflicted. The more threatening your target area is, the more aggressive you've got to be with your attack run, and the more precariously inverted and nose down the attacking aircraft will be during the final seconds to maintain the pod track and not overfly the target. But obviously, if it's not as defended, because the anti-aircraft artillery and SAMs can't reach up as high as you, or because the seed package destroyed all of it, or because it's near the end of the mission and you've already done the work killing all the Shilkas, then yes, you can make less aggressive turns, or potentially, if you're totally certain it's a defenseless target, decide to overfly the target. There's always a risk of that, and there's pretty much never a reason you need to overfly where you couldn't have done right hand off after drop. Over time, as you get better, you'll be able to put your IP point in closer than 12 miles, closer to 8, or maybe a little bit further. But really, you got to feel comfortable specific pilot RIO combination to make a decision. The reason why 8 nautical miles is, to me, the minimum is it's a little less than a minute from the time that you put the nose on until the bomb explodes, and there's a lot of work to be done, as discussed during that period of time. Another thing to consider, you want to be dropping your rear weapons first. So on the Tomcat, you have 4 slots under the center line. Obviously, one's taken with the pod, and you can't actually fit an LGB on the wing station. So really, it's got to do with the 4 LGBs that you're going to carry in the center line. If you don't drop the ones in the rear pylons first, the aircraft becomes massively unstable. And it's going to affect your handling characteristics, and potentially, depending on what else is wrong with your aircraft, you could crash it. So that may help determine what type of targets you engage on your first run. You can carry a very large penetrator on the rear right, and so even if there are small targets in air defenses, sometimes it makes sense to drop that on the bunker just to get it off the jet. This assumes you don't have anybody else to call in for the Shilka or some other target that you might expend the left rear bomb on that is not as large. But in the end, you want to expend the rear 2 weapons first, preferably the heaviest of the 2 first as well. Finally, in between attacks, or if you're holding out at the fixed point and you're a wingman in a Tomcat op, it's a really good idea to occasionally utilize your air-to-air mode to try and maintain SA. Once a Tomcat in your squad commits to an attack run, it's going to be really target saturated, or task saturated, I should say. Even though everybody's flying air to ground that night, and even if you don't have any air-to-air weapons, it does help if you are a wingman, providing at least knowledge that the airspace is clear.
Is Jester smart enough to drop the rear bomb first?
So what you would need to do with Jester is, as a pilot, you should have a good idea of what pylons have what weapons on it, and the knee board carries that knowledge, and you tell him to select, for example, the GBU-10 that's on the back, or the 24. Make sure that you drop it first.
Okay.
Definitely encourage you guys to go on the practice server and try flying around with a heavy bomb in the back and nothing else. It's a strange experience, and especially the limit handling the plane becomes very unstable. So you'll realize quick why you don't want to have that. All right, so with that, I think for a standard laser attack, most of you guys, assuming you can follow this, are going to be sitting pretty. So that's really all we were going to chat about today. Again, the appendix does have the bindings guides in it. This is a refresher. The green ones are ones you definitely need to have. Yellows are really good to have. Everything else is only nice to have. They're for pilots, and there's also RIO, which does include turn items. So you can see the yellow sections here. Slides for you. All right. Any questions around attack method, terminology?
I'm good.
All right. That will go ahead and wrap it up.
All right.
Coming, guys.
Thank you, Hammer, for putting these on.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Hammer.
Yeah, no worries. No, I keep getting stalled with work stuff. I do plan on uploading these, and we'll put the YouTube links in the training section. All right, thanks, guys. Cheers.